If the branch committee determines that there is a need for your services, they will decide where you can best be used, whether at Bethel or perhaps on a theocratic construction assignment. Submitting your application may open a door of opportunity to serve Jehovah and his organization in a variety of ways.
That's how they ask for recruits to live and work for free in the cult compound, with a recycled video from 5 years ago. It's crazy to me how little material they produce, since producing spiritual food was supposed to be what placed this cult apart. How many volunteers could they possibly need now that they went from having dozens of complex printing machines in every single Bethel to just being a glorified YouTube channel?
This symposium now will help us to see how the four Gospels are unique, each in their own way, and why we can trust each four of them. Each Gospel writer tells his own story of the Christ. Each Gospel writer has his own personality. He has his own reasons to write. He has his own theme, and he is writing for a particular audience or reader.
And has their own version of events that often contradict each other too. This talk is just to gaslight listeners, telling them that the differences in the Gospels are simply because the four writers were different people writing for different audiences. Matthew and Luke give very different Jesus genealogies, with Matthew, for example, saying Jesus was a descendant of David through Solomon, while Luke saying it was through David's son Nathan, among many, many other differences. But if you want to get to a bit where every single Gospel contradicts the others, just check what each Gospel says what happens after the death of Jesus. We'll get into it, but every Gospel has a completely different story to tell, with many contradictions among them. But to Jehovah's Witnesses, it's all okay, because they only know that the Bible cannot contradict itself. And they don't even read the Bible, so they believe things like these.
But the more we read and study the inspired Gospels, the more we love them. Each one is unique, and yet they are harmoniously put together to complement each other, like the voices in a choir. And together they beautifully convey the good news of Jesus Christ.
No, they're not harmoniously put together to complement each other. They contradict each other all of the time. As a general rule of thumb, the newer the gospel is, the less human and more divine Jesus gets. They contradict each other on how and when Jesus met his first disciples, the birth narrative, the timing of the Last Supper, the date and time that Jesus died and who was there to witness it, and everything that happened after his death. It seems like the more significant an event is in the story of Jesus, the more the Gospels contradict each other about how it happens, because that's how legends work. The Gospels are simply different versions of Jesus, what he did and how to follow him, written for different people at different points in time. If they were voices in a choir, they would all be singing completely different songs from different genres and in different languages. That's why we are going to use this symposium to debunk the Gospels one by one.
How is Matthew's Gospel unique? Well, Matthew wrote his Gospel for the benefit of the Jews, the Hebrews. Matthew's approach clearly reveals that he had a purpose, an intention, and it was to convince his fellow Jews that Jesus from Nazareth is the promised Messiah. Matthew repeatedly refers to the Hebrew Scriptures, some 100 references, and he makes some 40 direct, more or less, quotations from the Hebrew Scriptures. Matthew explains how Jesus fulfilled prophecies in those Scriptures. In chapter 2, for example, verse 15, he says, this fulfilled what was spoken by Jehovah through his prophet. Verse 17 says, then was fulfilled what was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet. Verse 23, and he came and settled in a city named Nazareth in order to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. Matthew also listed Jesus' genealogy beginning from Abraham, the forefather of the Jewish nation.
This all shows many of the differences that Matthew has. Matthew is more focused on presenting Jesus as an authoritative new Messiah and the new Moses. That's why his genealogy starts with Abraham and follows the line of David through Solomon to emphasize Jesus' royal lineage. It's also constantly quoting the Old Testament and Old Testament prophecies and telling you how Jesus fulfilled them, almost as if the author wrote the story retroactively to tie Jesus to the Old Testament. As you heard, the Gospel of Matthew is written in Greek, not just Greek, but a sophisticated form of it. Why would a tax collector write such a thing when he would have spoken Aramaic or Hebrew as a primary language? Also, this gospel takes a lot from the Gospel of Mark, word for word, which came earlier. Why would Matthew the apostle copy someone else's work if he was a witness? No, the author of the gospel is anonymous, but based on what he wrote and how he wrote it, we can assume he was a highly educated Jewish Christian writing for people like him. That's why his gospel is centered around 5 major discourses, which some scholars have seen as mirroring the books of the Torah, and why he's desperate to connect Jesus to the Old Testament, to retroactively find prophecies in the Old Testament and having Jesus fulfill them to bring Jewish people into the Christian faith.
However, is it also authentic and trustworthy? Yes, Matthew's gospel has the ring of truth. Matthew wrote humbly. He wrote honestly, as we would expect from anyone who spoke from God. For example, as we said, Matthew was a former tax collector, and he himself plainly acknowledged that. When he lists the names of the 12 apostles in Matthew chapter 10, verse 3, he doesn't mention the background of any of the other apostles, but he mentions Matthew, the tax collector. And this was not precisely bragging or a badge of honor in that society. Any Jew being a tax collector for the Roman Empire at the time was highly despised, we could say, and lowly regarded on the same level as apostates, outcasts, traitors, and sinners of all kinds. They were not even eligible to be witness in a court. Matthew, thus, was very candid about himself, and he doesn't minimize or hide his own or the other disciples' mistakes or weaknesses.
As I mentioned before, the author of Matthew isn't Matthew, and the author never said he was Matthew. We know for a fact that he couldn't have been Matthew because this gospel was written around 50 years after the death of Jesus, so Matthew the apostle couldn't have survived for that long. But that's not all. We also know that the gospel makes multiple mistakes that would be hard to make if it was directly inspired by God. For example, in the 8th chapter, he writes about Jesus encountering 2 demon-possessed men in the region of Gadarenes, which would be impossible since that's miles away from the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus was supposed to be. Mark and Luke place this event in the region of Gerasenes, which still poses geographical issues, but Matthew's version seems particularly implausible. Between geographical errors and gospel contradictions, you can only say it rings with truth if you've never studied it. And to be fair, practically no Jehovah's Witness has. Also, did you notice how he said tax collectors were like apostates? This is stupid for 2 reasons. First, apostates were not a thing in the 1st century, at least not how this cult imagines them. And second, wouldn't that mean that someone like an apostate may actually have something to say if they were inspired to write a gospel?
And of course, there are some critics who say that the 4 Gospels contradict each other in some places. But to sincere readers, such criticism seems petty and trivial and can easily be proven wrong.
Was the Last Supper a Passover meal? Matthew says it was, but John says it happened before. When was Jesus born? Matthew says it was during the reign of the King Herod the Great, which ends up becoming a big deal in the story. Luke, however, says he was born during the census ordered by Caesar Augustus when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Historical records place his census around 627 CE, which is about 10 years after Herod died. Let's do one more. What were Jesus' final words? Well, according to Matthew, Jesus cries to God, asking why he had forsaken him, then screams and dies. According to Luke, Jesus screams, then uses his last words to commend his spirit to God. And according to John, he simply says, "It is finished," before dying. All of these are irreconcilable differences between the Gospels. And if you think events like the death of Jesus are trivial, you aren't being sincere, as this guy is implying. In fact, if you want to be sincere, like he's pretending to be, you have to acknowledge that the Gospels contain irreconcilable differences, and then let that affect your faith however it will, instead of trying to fool yourself into thinking there are no differences in the Gospels, despite your lying eyes. However, why wasting your time studying the Bible for what it really is, when we could instead watch a pretend documentary?
Grenfell and Hunt collected some 500,000 fragments at Oxyrhynchus, many of which are biblical and now reside right here in Oxford. Amongst them, other fragments from Matthew. Analysing and understanding these manuscripts and scraps became known as papyrology, deciphering letters and words, putting the pieces together. Painstaking work, like doing a fragile jigsaw puzzle.
This guy is a pretend documentarian. He's not an expert on anything except Jehovah's Witness apologetics. That's why it is insane to me that this cult got access to papyri from the collection of the University of Oxford to make this little propaganda piece. This is why we need to raise awareness around this cult, because they love to say they're the most persecuted religion ever, while getting an open invitation to record in a private tour of the Oxford Library, all so they can say stuff like this.
Scholars who have examined these texts attest to the close continuity of meaning between these earliest fragments and later manuscripts, which form the basis for our translation today.
This is why Jehovah's Witnesses are doing this pretend documentary, to validate their beliefs. They are at Oxford pretending to be scholars, holding some of the most ancient copies of the Gospels and pretending there's a direct correlation between those and their translation of the Bible. A translation that's not even considered a valid translation by any biblical scholar, made by people who didn't have any knowledge of ancient languages. This content here is just to gaslight and fool viewers, and I gotta believe that the only reason why this pretend documentarian didn't go further into his unhinged beliefs is because even he knows that they will never be allowed back if they are too outright truthful about their beliefs in Oxford. Let's just skip to the next speaker, who is going to tell us the differences of Mark while trying his very best to imitate how a real person moves and emotes.
And who was his primary audience? It was the Romans. And so Mark carefully described Jewish customs and also the plant and animal life of Palestine so that he could assist them or aid them. In addition, we know that as we examine this gospel account, Mark focused not so much on Jesus' sermons or teachings, but for the most part, he focused on Jesus' activities or miracles. And throughout this gospel account, Mark also highlights on several occasions Jesus' feelings or emotions.
The Gospel of Mark is considered to be the oldest of them all, and therefore talks about a Jesus that's extremely human. The Jesus in Mark is a hot-headed and impatient but relatable man who often goes misunderstood, with disciples constantly being too dense to understand what Jesus is trying to say. He's also very much anti-Peter too. You know that verse in Matthew that says that Jesus told Peter that he will build his church on him? Yeah, there's none of that here. In fact, Jesus calls Peter Satan, and the last we hear of Peter in Mark is him denying Jesus 3 times and then running away. There's no redemption for him. He's just a fool and a coward who betrays his master before leaving the story forever.
Mark's gospel is also trustworthy. We know that our early Christian brothers in the first century and sisters were willing to suffer and even die. And some were even confronted by the Roman army or government and thrown into the Roman Colosseums, and they were viciously killed by wild beasts. What gave them that firm conviction to suffer and to die? Well, they had confidence. They had confidence in Mark's gospel as well as the other gospel accounts, which shows or states that Jesus was resurrected. And so they knew that since Jesus was resurrected, even if they were to suffer and die, then they would be resurrected too.
No, Mark never implies that you'll be resurrected. It barely implies that Jesus was. But before we get to that, the speaker touches on an interesting thing. Some scholars say that this gospel may have been written when Nero was emperor and victimizing Christians. That's why the focus of Mark is enduring suffering like Jesus, because that's what those Christians needed to do to maintain their faith. What Mark doesn't say is what the Jehovah's Witnesses just said, that Jesus was resurrected. If you ignore the latest additions to the end of Mark, like the Jehovah's Witnesses do, then Mark ends when Mary Magdalene, another Mary, and Salome go to anoint the body of Jesus, only to see that the stone had been rolled away and the body was gone. That's it. That's how it ends. Sure, it's kind of an open ending, but the only records of his resurrection in Mark are the later editions. If you don't read those, you just end up wondering who stole the cadaver of Jesus, and that's it. And weirdly enough, that's what the pretend documentary says next.
In the New World Translation, Mark's Gospel ends at chapter 16, verse 8, where we are told that after visiting Jesus' tomb, the women fled, trembling and overwhelmed with emotion, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were in fear. Unlike the other Gospels, Mark doesn't report on any post-resurrection encounters with Jesus. The closest we get to him is an empty tomb. Some later readers evidently felt that this conclusion lacked enough closure to have been the original. From the 5th century onwards, manuscripts appeared with alternative conclusions, some with 2 additional verses, and others with 12. What about the Codex Vaticanus? Let's see for ourselves. Here, the original Greek has been translated, "And going out, they fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Below that, the ancient ink states, "according to Mark," indicating the end of the book. The Codex Sinaiticus also concludes this way. Together, these 2 pillars provide strong support for verse 8 as the original ending penned by Mark.
This really shows how poorly planned these speeches really are. The point of the speaker was that the Gospel of Mark reinforces our belief in the resurrection, and the pretend documentarian goes out to say that Mark is the only gospel that doesn't list a resurrection. That's how little sense spiritual food makes nowadays. They do provide an amazing explanation of why Mark didn't write about arguably the most important miracle in the Bible, though.
So why the seemingly abrupt ending? Well, the Gospel writers each had their own style. And simply put, Mark's was brevity. Guided by the Holy Spirit, Mark's concise style produced the shortest yet most dynamic portrayal of Jesus as a man of action, a man of miracles, and a man of true compassion.
Oh, it was because Mark's style was to not write about the most important part of the whole story. Got it. Seriously, how can you think this makes sense? The point of Jesus is that he resurrected after 3 days, proving that he was the Son of God by surviving death. And it just wasn't in Mark's style to write that down? No, actually, what happened is that Mark's gospel is the earliest one we have, and therefore the one that has the least amount of details added onto. Remember, the longer a legend stays around, the more mystical and unbelievable it will get. Mark was written for a very early version of Christianity, where the Roman Catholic view that focused on the suffering and sacrifice of Jesus as the point of the story. That's why the Gospel of Mark doesn't prove what the speaker wasted 15 minutes saying it proves, even by their own standards. But that's all for now. Thank you so much to my supporters who are getting access to these videos several days in advance. If you want to watch the next video, you can do that by becoming a Patreon or YouTube supporter like these guys right here, or turn on your notifications so you are the first to know when it goes public.